Can you guys see my screen okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
All right, great. So thank you for the introduction. So this talk is going to be first off, a collaboration between me and many of my undergraduate students who helped me collect spiders, identify things, etc. It was actually published last week in Environmental Entomology. And so there's the DOI down there. And so before I start, I'd just like to quickly thank my field team, as well as some arachnologists who helped me do some IDs, some individuals who helped set fires, and the Indiana Division of Forestry for funding. So there are many ways we can look at the ways that ecosystems respond to fire. One of those is resistance, basically the ability of an ecosystem to resist change or remain unchanged when subject to some type of disturbance. And the other, which is more of the focus of this study, is resilience. And really, we're looking at the ability and rate of an ecosystem to recover from some type of disturbance. And of course, our case is going to be fire. And so fires can act as habitat disturbances, and they have many effects. They've been shown to have the ability to influence forest structure by producing many different age communities, but also reducing habitat heterogeneity. They can also influence forest health by oftentimes increasing photosynthetic rates and reducing fuel load, getting rid of leaf litter, getting rid of small underbrush, and thereby reducing the chance of wildfires in the future. Fires have also been shown to influence the soil, increasing nutrient availability, but also at the same time increasing rates of erosion. So when it comes to spiders in fire, there's been a good amount of previous work on the response of spiders in this type of disturbance. Many of the previous studies, however, are short-term, and so they look at less than a year after fire and what happens just after a year. Some of the studies that we examined were long-term, but they examined non-forest habitats, so they don't directly apply to some of the things we looked at. And also some of those long-term studies that were in forests were oftentimes on vastly different spider taxa in different parts of the world. That's not to say these studies are not important or not applicable, but the differences must be taken into account when trying to compare to studies like this. So the few similar studies that we did look at found that there was quick recolonization of spiders after fire in habitats. There was fairly resilient spider assemblages. There was an initial reduction in species richness and also a reduction in abundance. This study is part of the hardwood ecosystem experiment, which is basically a 100-year-long study that was started in 2006 with different management practices occurring, one of which is, of course, prescribed burns. But also in other areas, there are clear cuts. And generally, there are different scientists from different institutions looking at different taxa and how those taxa respond to fire and management in this way. Our study began in January 2015 and went through last year, 2020. So we had 8 sites in central Indiana, 2 different state forests, Morgan-Monroe State Forest and Yellowwood State Forest. We had 2 sites in the former and 6 in the latter. All sites were at least 150 meters apart, and each site contained 3 different sections. These sections were our replicated unit, and each section was at least 80 meters apart from each other, and we had 24 total sections. And so here's a map of our sites in the top right here. You can see that in Indiana, we're looking at basically a little south of Indianapolis. Our sites 1 and 2 in the top left, you can see the sections of the sites of 3 sections each. Sites 3 through 6 were here, and you can see those 12 here. And then sites 7 and 8 were here. So this is a lot of sampling by my students. And so the treatments were basically burned separately on varying dates and also varying years, and giving us a staggered number of a staggered timeline. And I'll show you that in a second. Collection of spiders occurred via pitfall trapping, 2 per section, which were pooled, and then Burley's funneling of the leaf litter that we collected, 1 bag per section. We tried to sample throughout the year, January, March, May, and July, and September. We couldn't sample in November due to hunting season, and we didn't want to be out there during hunting season, probably a bad idea. And so this was through 5 years. We had an equal sample size across treatments, and this gave us 4 basic different treatments. We had an unburned treatment, less than 1 year since the burn, 1 to 2 years since the burn, and 2 to 3 years since our burn. And so to give you an example of what the staggered sampling times were like, you can see the different sites on the y-axis here, and notice that we have unburned in the orange. These were not always at the same time, and oftentimes they overlapped other treatments that were in other sites. And so this reduced the effective seasonality on any one particular treatment. And so in our data analysis, all the spiders were identified to the deepest taxonomic level possible. Guilds were assigned with some slight modification via Cardoso et al. 2011. We did a bunch of ANOVAs to look at abundance of any particular family that had at least 100 individuals captured. Same for the guild. We looked at species richness and the differences in Shannon-Wiener diversity index. And then lastly, we did a few NMDS, non-metric multidimensional scaling analyses, looking when taxonomic assemblages of spiders were grouped by species, when those assemblages were grouped instead by guild. And then lastly, we looked at taxonomic assemblages when they're only consisted of females, and we excluded the males. And I'll talk about some of what we found there. So we found around 3,000 different spiders, the most being Linophiidae, of course, anybody who knows me. We also found Phorolithids, Heniids, Gnaphosids, Lycosids, Homicids, Agelenids, all the things you would associate with leaf litter and spiders in the ground. We also caught a lot of ground spiders, but all these were included. We included everything in our analysis, regardless if it was a ground spider or not. But our targeted traps did the job. We did catch mostly ground spiders. Some interesting patterns emerge when looking at specific species. For example, if we look on the left here, this was the most common species found in the unburned habitats. In this column is the less than 1 year since the burn, 1 to 2 years since the burn, and 2 to 3 years since the burn. Notice that Fluorotympus palustris, the guardstone spider, didn't matter what treatment it was always the most abundant spider in all the treatments. However, you see some of these other species, such as Originatus frustratus, Tapinosaura emergeni, and Ceratocellus latidens, had this drop off after the fire, and then some of them rebounded and came back after a few years. And then we had an interesting one like Myrmecis maculatus, where it had a higher abundance after the fire, a higher relative abundance after the fire, and that was sustained throughout the post-fire treatments. When looking at overall abundance, we saw, like other studies did, a reduction in abundance. And so mean abundance was reduced after the fire and did not recover after 2 to 3 years. And these letters indicate significant differences here. When we looked at individual families, we saw that some families, for example, in the blue and the orange, which was Agelenidae and Gnaphosids, and then in the green and the purple, the Phorolithids and the Talmicids, were reduced after fire and never came back, at least after 3 years. In abundance, the Heniids, Linophiids, and Lycosids, however, did not change after fire. They were not significantly affected in abundance by the fire. We saw different patterns when we organized spiders by guilds. We saw ambushers, which is just Talmicids, so the same as the previous slide there, reduced after fire, but also ground hunters, when they were grouped together, they did reduce after fire and did not rebound. But we saw other hunters and sheet web weavers, the gray here and the red, were reduced after the fire, but then started to come back, how the 2 to 3 years was not significantly different than our unburned habitats. And also the space web weavers were not affected by fire, at least in abundance. When looking at Shannon-Wiener diversity index, there was no significant difference among any of the treatments. However, we did see this trend, how again, sort of like we saw in the families, is decreasing and then slowly trending to rebound. Same thing when we looked at species richness, not statistically significant, but again, we see this trend decreasing, starting to rebound.
10 minutes.
Thank you. So lastly, when we looked at the NMDS analyses, when we looked at species assemblages, so when they were organized by species, our unburned spider assemblages looked like this. And this unburned spider assemblage was significantly different than our less than a year, 1 to 2 year, and 2 to 3 year treatments. Similarly, when we looked when these assemblages were organized by guild, we saw that our unburned treatment was significantly different than the less than 1 year, 1 to 2 year, and 2 to 3 year taxonomic assemblages. However, when I was looking at this, I noticed this seemed like a lot of noise. There was a good amount of overlap. And I wanted to see what would it look like if we just examined just the female's response to fire. And my thinking here was that males are vagrant, they move a lot. Perhaps they're interfering with this real pattern of resilience, and it's showing really there's a different pattern here. So when we looked at just females, the unburned treatments here are shown here. Then after 1 year, this is what happened to the taxonomic assemblages in the females. Just exploded and were all over the place and were very different. What was really interesting here was that after just 1 to 2 years, they came back to a very, very similar state as the unburned habitats in 2 to 3 years as well. And so this is showing a completely different type of pattern than when we look at all the spiders' abundance combined together, which I thought was quite interesting. So in conclusion, fire did significantly impact spider assemblages. Fire decreased abundance, but was highly taxa dependent, as we saw, and guild dependent. This resilience was dependent on the guild, it was dependent on the family, and even as we saw when we looked at the most abundant species, was dependent on the species that we examined. And so with that, I thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions that you may have.
Okay, so let's see one question coming in. Did you prescribe burns occur the season that fire will naturally occur in these systems?
So these prescribed burns were done basically when the conditions were right. And so largely they looked at weather conditions to try to determine when fire is going to be done. I don't know if it was specifically done during the times when this is naturally occurring or not.
Paul is asking, what do you think will be the effect on fire intensity?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most of these fires were fairly low intensity with 2 to 3 foot flames. I assume that a higher intensity would probably burn away a lot more leaf litter, probably reduce abundance even more, because even after these fires went through, we did see a mosaic patchiness to where the leaf litter was and was not. And oftentimes that could influence what was left behind, right? If we're sampling, for example, leaf litter for Burley's funnel sampling, oftentimes we had a hard time finding leaves. And then sometimes after a burn, we didn't have a hard time. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. The intensity of the fire is definitely going to influence what's left behind afterwards.
Did you by any chance remove the males from all the other species and see if any of the one species significantly decrease, like even just kind of dropping off to one, single percent digits?
Like if we removed males?
Yes, from the other, not from the top, from your top 5, but from the other species.
That's a good question. No, we didn't look at that. We generally, when we looked at species composition and species abundance, we looked at overall, but that'd be an interesting thing to look at because that would reflect in the final analysis that NMDS, which species are having the greatest influence on that. Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, I have to move on. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
And